Good evening, everybody. As always, thank you for your hospitality. I would like to begin by pointing out that this is a profane speech and that I will therefore confine myself to sharing some points of reflection and some perplexities and anxieties that came up while reading St. Francis's Canticle of the Creatures. I would like to begin with an observation of method that I drew from Gianfranco Contini, the well-known literary critic, who has also devoted a short essay to the analysis of Francesco's Canticle. Contini's analysis is formal and stylistic, so the content of his essay is not particularly interesting for the purposes of this conversation. But I was struck by one of his remarks, because Contini began his analysis by assuming that the song is a text. A bit special because it's part of our literary canon. It is also part of our own tradition, our popular tradition. Because everyone knows this text and even vaguely knows its content. It is well known, so it's one of those texts that because it's so layered in our memory, it's taken for granted because it is very familiar. However, Contini writes that when you get to read it, what seemed like familiarity actually turns into something profoundly different. And we realize that we've never raised a lot of issues before concerning this. It has never actually been the subject of reflection. This experience, which Contini talks about, is kind of what happened to me. Because in my imagination, the canticle represented, and in some ways still represents, the model of praise, together probably with some passages of the Psalms. And yet, reading it again for this seminar, reading it again with a new eye, perhaps even analyzing it for the first time carefully, not taking it for granted as perhaps it had always happened to me, I was struck by a series of perplexities that have tempered the Arcadian image of the canticle and the figure of Francis as a serene contemplator of the beauties of creation. Moreover, this has been an observation made by Massimo Cacciari. He noticed in a careful reading of his writings that Francis was in fact a difficult and harsh figure, because he proposed an extremely difficult task, and therefore inevitably ended up articulating and complicating the image of Francis, who is known only for his ecstasy towards creation. So let's say what I'd like to do with this talk, which is very short anyway. Firstly, I'd like to share what have been the perplexities and also the novelties that have made me think a little while rereading the song carefully, and secondly, talk about what have been the attempts on my part to give meaning to these perplexities. So the points that struck me when I read the song are essentially three. First, as has been pointed out several times in other speeches, this song has a descending order, in the sense that the different elements that are called praise the Most High through the intrinsic, specific, and positive characteristics of these elements. So the sun, which also symbolizes the Lord Himself, illuminates. The stars and the moon are recalled for their beauty and their preciousness. Water, because it's useful. The air, the sky, the wind, because regardless of the season, they provide livelihood. And even fire, that we might generally associate with destruction, is what illuminates the night, and the earth gives us nourishment. But when it comes to man, we notice that man praises the Most High not for what the philosophical tradition has specifically attributed to him, that identifies him for his specific difference as might be his intelligence or creativity. Man is not even identified for those peculiar actions or behaviors that Christianity prescribes: to love one's neighbor, to love creation. When in the Canticle man makes his appearance, accompanied by infirmity and tribulation, he is defined by actions and behaviors that are in fact impossible for man: to forgive, to suffer, and to die. So, we refer to man who forgives in the name of God's love, who calmly endures suffering, also because we can only forgive something that has truly made us suffer. We can only forgive the unforgivable, as Socrates wrote, and who dies in body. So he forgives, suffers, and dies in the body, being careful not to die in the condition of mortal sin, so that death will not harm him. In this passage referred to man, death is incited twice. The first time as sister bodily death, and the second death that for some, under certain conditions, will not hurt. So it's as if man could testify to his ability to praise and to some extent testify to his faith only by confronting the impossible, uncovering man with his limits and with what he generally shelters with all his strength. Another point I would like to emphasize is the position of man with creation. He does not occupy a leading position, and he is not even worthy to mention the Most High, even if he then does mention him. But anyway, starting with the sun and then go down in a descending direction, and you get to the man on a scale. However, the various elements mentioned, while on the one hand they highlight the abyss between the Most High and man, on the other hand they soften it a little. This is something that has emerged from the previous meetings too. How do they weed it out? Because at the end of the day, man seems to be the last step. But man needs the other elements in order to survive. That is, they are listed and are called because they allow man to survive. The sun illuminates, the air gives man sustenance, the earth nourishment. He is the recipient at the end of all these elements of creation. He is made a recipient in flesh and blood, in his own body, nutrition and the things he needs to see. So light, air, water, etc. So man is set up as a recipient in flesh and blood in his body, despite the fact that his body apparently serves no purpose other than to die, perish, and decompose. So the body has only one destination, a sore bodily death that no man can escape. And then I was struck by the sister attribute, referring to the bodily death, which refers to kinship, domesticity, and comfort. Yet, these are verses that at first are not very comforting, because no one can escape infirmity, tribulations, endurance, and even the reference to the second death, that it will cause no pain. Calling it sister does not completely moderate the harshness of the previous verses. It is not a revival in different stylistic form of the long run and fortunate philosophical tradition on bodily death elaborated by Phaedon, in the sense that even if death is mentioned as something which won't be painful to all, bodily death is not presented as something liberating. So we are far from the atmosphere loaded with pathos, expectations, or reassurance that characterize the death of Socrates and Phaedon. The beginning of a whole philosophical tradition of seeing bodily death in this liberating light. So, what does the reference to sisterhood mean in this context? Why introduce a sister dimension amongst tribulations? In the face of these questions that I have asked myself reading the song, I have simply tried to give meaning, or at least to interpret the value of all these elements in two ways. Firstly, I'd like to address something that might seem trivial at first, but is actually quite immediate. Reflecting on the themes of tribulation, death, and suffering intertwined with the human experience depicted at the end of the song, amidst all the beautiful elements of creation, one inevitably encounters the portrayal of humanity. This brought to mind a widely recognized painting, The Crucifixion by Grunwald, from the early 15th century, commissioned for the Isenheim Hospital. However, I won't delve into sharing it now as its frame renders it unnecessary for present discussion. This altarpiece is widely renowned for its multi-layered symbolism, typical of many altarpieces which refuse closure. Instead, they unfold, revealing deeper narratives. What sets this altarpiece apart is its unique depiction of Christ's suffering, rendered with an almost expressionistic intensity. The landscape, too, exudes an obscure, menacing quality. My immediate association with this image upon reading the song stems from a profound impression it left on me. Upon first encountering it, I was struck by a comment from the writer Iaconetti, who described it as a stark warning to humanity, suggesting that life offers no solace. However, Iaconetti's interpretation of the altarpiece was fundamentally flawed, much like my initial understanding of the song. Contrary to what he believed, the purpose of the altarpiece was not to provoke or tantalize viewers, but rather to offer solace to the sick at the Isenheim Hospital who suffered from a disease akin to leprosy. How could such a depiction of suffering provide comfort? Because in portraying Christ's agony, the altarpiece embodied the essence of empathy and understanding. Christ, by incarnating human suffering, demonstrated the three seemingly impossible acts: forgiveness, endurance of suffering, and death. And of course, his resurrection followed. Yet it was his embodiment of the human condition, encompassing forgiveness, suffering, and death, that resonated with those in need of consolation. These themes, initially perceived as grim aspects of the human condition, ultimately elevate mankind to profound heights of praise. Here's another line of thought to consider. The first thought, to some extent, revolves around the figure described in the Canticle. The second thought is that this figure, amidst his infirmities, tribulations, and eventual bodily death, the second death, and facing the three seemingly impossible acts, represents a distinctly modern archetype. Modernity here lies in the complete departure from the Promethean archetype. We're all familiar with the myth of Prometheus, handed down to us through philosophical and literary traditions. Prometheus, in his tragic tale, is punished for stealing fire from the gods, the very essence of technique and survival, which he then gifted to humanity. This act stemmed from humanity's lack of inherent qualities for survival, as his brother had forgotten to distribute them properly. Consequently, animals were equipped with these qualities, leaving humans dependent on this extra artifice for their survival. In a profound analysis of Aeschylus' Prometheus Bound, philosopher Umberto Eco, in his insightful book The Path from Here, explores a dialogue between the chorus and Prometheus. Here, Prometheus isn't punished solely for stealing fire and granting humanity the means to survive. Rather, his punishment stems from using this technology to shield humans from the harsh reality of their mortality, fostering an illusion of immortality. The technology, in this context, becomes both a remedy and a poison, as Prometheus infuses mankind with false hopes. Eco references a translation where Prometheus declares, "I endure this punishment because I have instilled blind hopes in humanity through my actions." Some translations suggest opaque hope, But the essence remains consistent. Thus, thanks to Prometheus' gift of technical ability, humans are liberated from immediate death, which they would not survive without. However, this freedom breeds the dangerous delusion of immortality, distancing them from the reality of their eventual demise. It's as though Prometheus, in his actions, shielded humanity from confronting its inevitable fate, accepting mankind as it is, flaws and all. In this sense, Francesco's man is entirely anti Promethean. However, I urge against misconstruing this expression. He embodies a deeply human essence, unillusioned and embracing the three seemingly impossible aspects of his condition, while Christianity offers the promise of resurrection. It exists within a framework where the human condition, as it stands, must inevitably transition. Why do I consider this song so distinctly modern? Why is being anti Promethean particularly relevant today? This doesn't imply a rejection of anthropocentrism. Rather, one could interpret the song as converging towards a focus on humanity. So it's not merely a matter of anthropocentrism. What does this anti Promethean perspective entail? Two significant points come to mind. Firstly, it involves embracing mortality as a counterbalance to certainty. From a political standpoint, amidst the rise of radicalism and increasingly politicized Christian fundamentalism, which often assert rigid certainties, Francis reminds us that the essence of our human condition lies in realms typically overlooked: forgiveness, suffering, and death. These dimensions, which allow us to fully embody our humanity, are not rooted in certainties. Secondly, the significance of anti Promethean perspectives extends to the context of the Anthropocene. Coined by scientists in the year 2000, the term refers to an era where humans have become a geological force capable of altering the planet's functioning. Among the intellectuals who have explored and popularized this concept is Deepesh Chakrabarty, an Indian born historian. Chakrabarty's work, which has sparked extensive discussions among historians and philosophers, reflects on the implications of the Anthropocene for our perception of historical time. He argues that one of its defining characteristics is the blurring of boundaries between human history and natural history, challenging our understanding of human temporality and historical narratives. So, how crucial is it within this context to assert an anti Promethean stance? In this regard, the Canticle emerges as an exceptionally modern text, characterized by its celebration of mortality and the acceptance of the seemingly impossible aspects of life, such as forgiveness and suffering. It champions life, as Guardini would have asserted, as the ultimate pursuit. In this perspective, it's not death but life that holds the final significance. Life is bestowed upon us precisely when we embrace the three impossibilities and acknowledge our mortality foremost. Perhaps this is why mortality and life are intertwined like siblings. I'd like to conclude with a brief excerpt from Guardini's work, The Last Things, which encapsulates the essence of the song we've been discussing. Moreover, it transcends a purely faith-based perspective, offering insights into philosophical reflection. In many ways, it resembles a Hegelian text, showcasing Christianity's pivotal role in the history of consciousness. It's a suggestion, but a worthwhile one. Simply replacing the word resurrection with existence, as suggested at one point, adds a depth to the reflection. With Mr. Guardini's words, I'd like to conclude this brief discourse. Guardini writes, Christianity acknowledges that death itself lacks inherent meaning and justifies resistance against it. Yet, it also acknowledges its stark reality and confronts its bitterness head on. Christianity rejects any attempt to soften death's severity with the Dionysian celebration of life or the supposed nobility of sacrificing oneself for certain values. Death is not the poetic ruin of Rilke's landscapes or the grand climates of Hölderlin's life. It is a bitter end. It does not arise from the intrinsic necessity of human existence, but from sin, the sin of all humanity, which each individual must confront and settle their debt with. Dying well entails recognizing this truth. Death, thus understood, is humanity's ultimate peril, navigated by Christ's guidance towards the great promise. This passage, to me, holds significance beyond its religious context, echoing in a Hegelian sense. Christ's death encapsulates all pain, abandonment, and torment that death entails. Yet it represents the visible reversal of everything that resurrection rightly signifies. Thank you for listening.